A boy with no school, no degree. Yet one day the entire Harvard Design Council sat in silence as he spoke about why a house should face the northern light. The city hadn't yet remembered itself. It still held its breath under the early July dark. Its windows cold, its sidewalks empty, the air steeped in the hush of an hour that belonged to no one. But they were already walking. A woman, her back tired and shaped by the weight of years, pushed a dented coffee cart that squeaked with every slab of sidewalk. Behind her, a small boy followed. He carried a cardboard box of paper cups in both arms. The weight didn't matter. What mattered was the sky above the brick domes of Harvard was just beginning to change, dark to gray, gray to silver. The woman was Irene, and the boy, small and quiet and barefoot in soul, was named Thomas, 12 years old, no school records, no medical file, not even a working address on paper. Just a name. A name whispered, never called. Thomas didn't go to class. He watched light. Every morning, he rose before it came, 4 a.m. sharp, and walked beside his mother from the edge of Somerville into the belly of Cambridge. Their coffee cart was the same one she'd bought after Thomas's father passed. Second-hand, rust along the frame, but steady. It had carried them through all the years that followed. They sold strong black coffee to students, professors, early commuters. Irene always smiled, even when her knees ached, even when the boys from the business school bargained too hard. Thomas didn't speak. He only watched. Watched how the early light hit the windows of Gund Hall, the School of Architecture. Watched how it climbed slowly across the brick, touched one column, skipped another. Watched the way shadows changed the shape of everything, how they thinned out space or fattened it, how the lines of a building could curve without ever moving just by the angle of the sun. No one had taught him that. But the boy knew. Light wasn't decoration. It was memory. Every morning, students dumped their old sketches into the bins outside the studio. Rejected floor plans, failed perspectives, models collapsed under bad glue and too little sleep. Thomas waited until no one was looking, then crept over to the bins and picked out the cleanest sheets. He didn't know how to read architectural code, didn't know what axial symmetry or load-bearing wall meant. But his fingers traced the lines like scripture. He began to draw over them, not to erase, but to complete. He never used rulers. His pencil was broken in half, no eraser. Yet on those rejected papers, Thomas built houses that didn't have doors or windows. Only light, only shadow, only the empty spaces where breath could pass through wood. There's one kind of light that comes just once a day. It happens around 6:17 a.m. in summer, when the sun rises at the exact angle to send a sliver of light between two brick chimneys and spill a streak across the south wall of the design school's east wing. Thomas stood still every morning, waiting for it. To anyone else, it looked like nothing. To him, it was a voice, a whisper of space, a reminder that even buildings can speak if you wait long enough to listen. He called it the hour the house breathes. One particular morning, a group of final-year architecture students spilled out of the studio. They were tired, carrying portfolios and rolled-up plans under their arms. One student, Jesse, broad-shouldered, full of sharp lines and sharper deadlines, noticed a small figure crouched by the bins. "Hey, what do you think you're doing with my project?" Thomas stood up slowly. He was holding a sheet of drawing paper. On it, a rough pencil line had been added, curving toward a shaded corner, creating a small space that hadn't existed before. A space for the morning light to fall through. I didn't mean to—" "That's not yours," Jesse snapped. Don't touch other people's work. Thomas held the paper close to his chest. I wasn't stealing, he said. The light was wrong. I was just trying to help it get in. It was the wrong thing to say. Jesse moved quickly. The coffee cart tilted, and one of the fresh cups, still hot, still steaming, slipped. It struck Thomas on the wrist, spilled across his forearm, down to the cement. The boy flinched. His skin reddened instantly. But he didn't drop the drawing. He just looked down at the edge of the page, where the heat had burned a small brown corner, and whispered, "Can I still keep it?" Jesse paused. For a moment, the street fell quiet. Then Jesse shook his head, muttered something, and walked away. Thomas bent down slowly and picked up the drawing, still wet with coffee, still smoking a little at the edge. He folded it carefully, twice, and tucked it into the side pocket of his hoodie. That evening, back at their room, a single basement unit with 2 folding cots and a tiny hot plate, Irene wrapped his wrist in a damp cloth. You should have said something. You should have called for me. Thomas looked at the wall. I didn't want to lose the light. His mother didn't know what he meant, but she had seen that look in her husband once, long ago, before the coughing started, before the construction jobs dried up, before they moved from house to room to hallway to shelter. It was the look of someone who didn't fear pain, but disappearance. The next morning, Thomas was there again, before the janitor unlocked the east gate, before the street lamps turned off, before the pigeons even stirred. At 4:00 a.m., he stood beneath the same archway, his injured hand cradled in his jacket, his eyes tilted skyward, watching the dark prepare to become light. No professor knew his name. No ID badge let him through a door. No file on record proved he was a student. But Thomas came, because he had a building to finish. Not with bricks, not with steel, but with light. And the memory of a home that no longer existed. When he drew, he wasn't imagining a place to live. He was trying to remember one. A house that used to be. A hallway with dust floating in late light. A father's hand pushing a chair back from the table. A mother's laugh from behind a curtain. A square of warmth on the kitchen floor, right where the sun came in. It was all gone. But light somehow remembered it all. And Thomas, with a broken pencil and a folded sheet of coffee-stained paper, was trying to draw his way back to it. And so, Harvard, centuries old, brick-bound, proud, had on its very edge a small boy who didn't know his fractions, didn't know his rights, didn't know he wasn't supposed to be there. Drawing homes with nothing but silence, memory, and the shape of sunlight before 6 a.m. There are houses you carry in your blood. Not the kind with addresses or blueprints, not wood and nail, but a place that holds the breath of those you once loved and never quite stopped missing. That was the kind of house Thomas began to draw. In the early mornings, after the burn on his arm had scabbed, after Jesse's anger had turned into distant silence, Thomas stopped copying the students' drawings. He started drawing from memory. Not memory like a photograph. No. Memory like light. Flickering, moving, half true, more feeling than fact. The house they used to live in, before his father died, before the landlord changed the locks, before the cold winter with no heating. It had only 2 rooms and no insulation. But there was a crack in the roof above the living room, a small one near the beam. Every morning around 6:15 the sun would slide in sideways through that crack. The dust would lift. The whole room would shine like something sacred. For those few minutes, Thomas's father, big hands, lined face, low voice, would always stop what he was doing. He'd just stand there, in the rectangle of sunlight, eyes closed, as if the house itself had become a chapel. That's how Thomas began designing his first model. He didn't have foam board or graph paper. He had coffee lids, napkins, chopsticks from the Thai place across the street, the cardboard rings from hot drink cups. He wasn't building a house. He was trying to trap light. He cut out a tiny circle in the roof, lined it with clear plastic, and called it the sky's window. He poked holes along the walls, facing east. One for 6 o'clock a.m., one for 6:10, one for 6:17. The precise moment he remembered the living room lighting up. Each hole cast a beam that moved slowly across the floor of his miniature house if you held it up to the morning sun. Some students passed by as he worked, crouched near the back steps of Gund Hall. A few laughed. One of them, carrying a tray of coffee and talking loudly on the phone, stepped too close and kicked the model without noticing. It cracked. 3 walls bent inward. The roof tore. Thomas didn't shout. He just picked up the broken pieces and, with fingers still trembling from the previous burn, started repairing them. No glue, just tape, pieces of string, a safety pin he found on the sidewalk. Then he placed the broken model down on the ground again and leaned in close. Not to look, but to listen. That's when Jesse saw him again. Jesse had spent a week avoiding the guilt he didn't want to name. He hadn't apologized, didn't know how. But something about the boy's posture, not angry, not ashamed, just attentive, made Jesse stop. He knelt down beside him, silent. The model had no doors, just openings, just air. "What is this?" Jesse finally asked. Thomas looked up. "It's where my father used to stand. When the light came in, I wanted to build it, so I'd remember it right." Jesse didn't know what to say, because he saw it now. The way the cracks in the model weren't flaws. They were intentional pathways, openings for light, for breath. Jesse thought of his own design, the one the professor had marked down last week for being visually impressive but lifeless. And this child, this untrained, unnamed child, had just shown him why. His spaces were perfect, but they didn't feel. The next morning, Jesse brought a real cutting board, a metal ruler, a fresh blade, foam sheets, balsa wood. He set them down beside Thomas without a word. "You know, if you wanted to make the model again, with better stuff." Thomas hesitated. "But this works already." "I know," Jesse smiled, kneeling down. "But it could work twice." They spent hours building. Jesse watched more than he helped. He learned more than he taught. Thomas didn't measure things the usual way. He measured with shadows. He'd hold up a piece of cardboard and ask, "What hour is this light from?" Or he'd poke a hole and say, "That one's for when Mom falls asleep. I wanted the room to hush." And Jesse understood, more deeply than he ever had, that architecture wasn't about walls. It was about time, and sound, and grief. One afternoon, Professor Raleigh walked by. He was the oldest member of the architecture faculty, a man known for his harsh critiques and long silences. But this time, he stopped. He saw the model on the stone steps, the angles, the restraint, the absence of vanity. "Who designed this?" he asked. Jesse hesitated. "He did," he said, pointing to Thomas. Raleigh raised an eyebrow. "And who is he?" Jesse swallowed. "He's not enrolled." The professor looked at Thomas, then at the model again. He didn't speak for a while. Finally, he said, "Whoever made this thinks in light, not in lines." Then he turned and walked away. That night, Thomas didn't go home right away. He sat under the stone arch, the model on his lap, watching the last of the golden light curl under the clouds. His mother called once. He said he was okay. He just wanted to stay a little longer. Not because of the professor, not because of Jesse, but because his house had finally come alive, and it glowed. The next morning he came earlier than usual, 3:45 a.m. The sky was still completely black, but Thomas waited. He wanted to see it from the beginning, the very beginning, the moment when light wasn't yet visible, but the space began to expect it. Because Thomas had started to believe something that would shape every house he would ever design. You don't build for light that is already there. You build for the light you hope will come. There are moments in a life that leave no sound behind, no applause, no announcement. They simply happen, quiet as dust settling on a windowsill, and yet everything after them shifts. This was one of those moments. It began with a sketch, left outside a studio door in the rain. Jesse had been up for 32 hours. He had 3 final projects due in 2 days. His apartment was a mess of ramen bowls and tracing paper. The fluorescent light above his desk had begun to flicker, making everything in his vision tremble. He hadn't meant to leave the drawing outside. It was his most personal design. A small, single-person home meant for an aging parent. One central space, no hallways, skylights shaped like memory. He had poured himself into it. But in the scramble to find his missing model, he had left the sketch resting on the edge of the window bay outside the studio. The clouds rolled in 15 minutes later. Rain came soft at first, then hard. The pencil lines blurred, the paper warped, and Thomas, huddled under the narrow eave of the building, watched the page shudder in the wind like something alive. He hesitated before stepping out, not because of the rain, but because he had learned, in the hardest way, that touching other people's drawings could bring more hurt than good. Still, something in him ached to help. The sketch wasn't ruined yet. The paper was wet, but the form was still clear. A beautiful shape, but closed. Too closed. There was no breath in it, no pathway for the light. Thomas crouched in the shadow of the studio's stone column. He took out his pencil stub, worn down to barely half an inch, and began to draw. Not much, just one stroke, a cut in the ceiling. Narrow, silent. Then another, a soft turn in the wall that would draw the afternoon light across the center of the room at just the right angle. He worked slowly, with the reverence of someone mending a sacred object. Then he stepped back and placed the sketch gently where it had been, now damp, now changed. Then he left. 5 minutes later, Jesse returned, breathless from the search for his model, and found the page. He blinked. The paper was soaked. His heart sank. He'd lost it. But then he looked closer and frowned. Something was different. A line had been added. Subtle, delicate, and precisely where the room had once felt. Dead. He hadn't drawn it. Someone else had. And it worked. The whole plan breathed now. It moved. He could feel it. The sunlight creeping through the cut ceiling, touching the floor like a hand. At first, Jesse thought one of his classmates had touched it. He rushed back inside. "Who fixed my sketch?" he asked the room. No one looked up. Just then, a voice from the hallway said, "Raleigh's coming," and the room went quiet. Professor Raleigh entered the studio the way a winter wind enters a barn, without warning and without apology. He was carrying his cane today, not because he needed it, but because it gave weight to his silence. He stopped near Jesse's desk, saw the warped page, the faint lines, did not speak for a long time. Then he asked, "Who drew this?" Jesse stood still. "It was mine. But someone added something." Raleigh leaned closer. His finger traced the pencil stroke, thin as a whisper, that changed the entire spatial logic of the plan. "This addition," he said, "was not made with the hand of a student." He paused. "This was made by someone who listens to space." Then he looked around. "Where is he?" No one answered, because no one knew. But in a shadow just outside the doorway, Thomas stood motionless, clutching his broken pencil, too afraid to speak, too hopeful to leave. That evening, Jesse couldn't stop thinking about the added line. How had someone so young understood so much? It wasn't design in the academic sense. It was something older, something truer, a kind of knowledge that didn't come from books, but from silence. The next day, Jesse returned to the same window bay, and Thomas was there, crouched on the ground, sketching a building made of light. No walls, no doors, just planes that caught morning sun, just spaces that hushed, just absence made sacred. Jesse didn't speak at first. He simply sat down beside him, cross-legged on the stone. After a minute, he said, "Was it you?" Thomas didn't answer, just kept drawing. Another few seconds passed. "You don't have to be afraid," Jesse said. "I'm not mad. I want to understand. That sketch, it was better with your line in it. Somehow it breathed." Still, Thomas said nothing. Then slowly, gently, he turned the page he was working on toward Jesse. On it was a shape, but not a house. It was a shadow, long, soft-edged, reaching across a floor at a specific angle. Next to it, a note written in messy block letters, "Light comes from here at 6:19. Jesse stared at the drawing for a long time. He didn't know what to say. He had spent 5 years studying form, mass, material, rhythm, but never once had he been taught to write down when the light entered a room. Thomas finally looked up. "If the light doesn't touch the middle of the house by morning," he said, "then the rest of the day feels too long." Then, almost as an afterthought, "That's what happened the day my dad died. The light was late. He didn't say anything, but I knew." Jesse said nothing. He didn't need to, because he understood now, in a way no professor could have prepared him for, that some architecture is built with grief, and some with hope. But Thomas's was made with both. That night, Jesse returned to the studio and unrolled his original design. He stared at it for hours. Then he picked up his pencil, and quietly, with a reverence that surprised even him, he redrew it, this time with light in mind. The next morning, Thomas wasn't there. But the sketch he'd been working on, the one with the shadow at 6:19, was folded, left on the stone where he always sat. On the back, a short message written crooked but clear. "Sometimes you have to make a space for light before it knows where to go. There are houses that disappear, not because they are torn down, not because time forgets them, but because no one who loved them is left to speak of them." But in one boy's hands, that house came back. Not as it once stood, but as it once felt. The space behind the architecture school was never meant for building. It was a service lane, a strip of stone, some rusted pipes, a drain that gurgled when it rained. But Thomas chose that spot as the place where his memory would live again. He arrived early, long before dawn. He had no blueprints, no budget, only cardboard boxes, strips of tape, and plastic coffee lids from his mother's cart. This time he wasn't drawing. He was constructing. The model took 3 days. No one helped. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know it was happening. By day, Thomas worked in silence. By night, he sat beside the nearly finished shape, fingers tracing the cardboard edges, as if coaxing them into memory. It wasn't a full house. It was a skeleton. 3 standing frames. A sloped roof. No walls. Just enough shape for the sun to slip through. Just enough shadow to cradle something lost. In the center, a square of paper marked 617. That's when the light would hit it. That's when the past would visit again. Inside the studio, Professor Raleigh had begun asking questions. "Has anyone seen the boy again?" Jesse nodded. "He's outside, building something." Raleigh grunted. "Then perhaps we should go outside and learn something." But no one moved, because students weren't trained to look for wisdom where credentials were absent, and Raleigh, for all his age, was still learning how to stand against that tide. That afternoon, a group of students wandered into the back lot. Some were laughing, tossing paper planes from a failed design assignment. They stopped when they saw it. "What is that?" "Looks like trash." "Cardboard junk?" One student stepped forward, annoyed. He didn't kick it, but he nudged it, hard. The side frame wobbled. The central beam bent inward. The paper marked 6-17 peeled back in the wind. "Who even put this here? It's just in the way." But then Jesse stepped out from the building. He saw the frame, saw the slope, the angles, the careful spacing of the gaps between beams, and something clicked. "Wait," he said quietly. "I've seen this before." It wasn't a full structure, but it was the exact geometry of the correction Thomas had drawn on his sketch weeks before. Same rhythm, same open ceiling, same shadow path across the floor. Only now, it was real. It stood in front of him, breathing in the light, not as a design, but as a memory made physical. That evening, Jesse told Raleigh. The professor came in silence, stood beside the frame, watched as the sun slid between 2 rooftops and lit the square of paper, now weighted with a stone to keep it from blowing away. He didn't speak. He simply watched. And as the sun faded, he turned to Jesse and asked, "Where does he learn these things?" Jesse said nothing, because there was no answer. Some truths come not from schooling, but from sorrow. Some children do not study the light. They are raised by it. Later that week, Raleigh did something rare. He gathered the senior class and said, "You will not be graded this semester on polish, or precision, or your use of computer models. You will be graded on whether your building wants to be touched by light." The room blinked. "If it does not long for the morning, you have built a tomb, and we already have too many of those." No one argued, because something in his voice made them believe it. That night, Thomas returned to the structure. Someone had left a folded blanket for him, a small bottle of glue, a sandwich in wax paper. No note. But that was the language the place had begun to speak now. Not praise, but quiet permission. Thomas didn't keep the model. The next morning, he took it down, beam by beam, careful as a man packing away the last belongings of someone who has passed. He folded the cardboard, saved the stone. The paper marked 617 he burned, not out of anger, but as a kind of ritual. Ash rose, and he watched it drift until it vanished into the dawn air like everything else he could not hold on to. The structure no longer stood, but something had been built anyway. Not in wood, not in paper, but in the way people began to listen. From that day on, students began to leave their drafts outside. Some incomplete, Some unfinished, some just too full of doubt. They weren't asking for critique. They were leaving them for him. And every few mornings they'd return and find new lines. Not better ones, not corrections, but questions. A skylight they hadn't imagined. A space of quiet they hadn't made room for. A note in pencil. What if the window turned here instead? They never saw him do it. But the whole school began to change, and when asked where these new ideas came from, some would say, "There's this boy." Others would say, "I don't know. It just felt like something the light wanted." But Professor Raleigh, he said nothing. He simply walked the hallways in the early morning. And once, just once, he was seen touching the wall, palm flat, as if waiting to hear the house breathe back. There was no announcement, no list, no invitation, no desk with his name. Just a quiet whisper in the hallway from Professor Raleigh to Jesse. Bring him in. And so, one morning, earlier than most students cared to rise, before the studio lights warmed, before the smell of ink and ambition filled the air, Thomas stepped into a classroom at Harvard, not as a student, not even as a visitor, but as a child, carrying nothing but a roll of newspaper sketches and the fear of being told to leave. The room went quiet. A few heads turned. One student frowned, whispered something under her breath. Another scoffed. "Is this a field trip?" Raleigh said nothing. He walked slowly to the center of the room, placed both hands on the old wooden table, and looked at them. "Today," he said, "someone else will speak." He turned to Thomas. "Come here, son." Thomas froze, then moved, slowly, feet unsure, like someone stepping into a church where they weren't sure if they believed. He reached the table, placed his sketches down. Some were smeared with coffee. Others wrinkled, rain-warped, held together with tape and silence. He didn't look up. "I don't know how to talk like you," he said. "I just know how light walks into a room. That's all I ever watch." No one laughed, not yet. He unrolled a page. It showed a small square house with no back wall, open to wind, open to morning. "This is where I lived before we lost it. I tried to draw it like I remember it felt. Not with doors, with hush." One student leaned forward. Another reached for their pencil without realizing. Then Thomas unrolled another sketch. "This one is a place I made up for when my mom sleeps. The roof's low, but there's a crack along the edge. The light comes in without waking her. I call it the soft edge." He glanced up. "I think buildings should let people rest, not just keep them dry." A hand went up. It was Professor Ellings. Tall, severe, with silver-framed glasses and an accent sharp as glass. "Mr. Raleigh," she said, "this is touching, but we're architects. We don't teach storytelling. This child lacks even the most basic vocabulary of design." She turned to Thomas. "Can you explain your spatial hierarchy? The programmatic circulation of your plan?" Thomas blinked. "I don't know what that means." She folded her arms. "Exactly." The silence that followed felt cold, until Raleigh stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time we remember that architecture did not begin in textbooks. It began when someone sat under a tree and asked, 'Where will the sun be when I wake up?'" He turned to Ellings. "You want programmatic circulation? Look at this child's drawing. The way light moves through the room is the only circulation that matters for the people who will actually live in it." A beat. "He's not here to pass our tests. He's here to show us what we've forgotten." The students didn't applaud, but they didn't look away either. Because something was happening. something quiet but unmistakable. They were beginning to see the room differently. They were beginning to see space as breadth, not just measurement. And they were beginning to see Thomas, not as a boy who didn't belong, but as someone who had always been there, waiting for them to notice. After class, Jesse walked with Thomas out into the courtyard. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Thomas asked, "Did I say something wrong?" Jesse shook his head. "No, you said something real." Later that night, Thomas sat under the eave where he first watched the 617 light. He opened his notebook, one a janitor had found in the trash and given to him. On the first page, he wrote, "Today I spoke where I shouldn't have been allowed, but they listened, some of them. That's enough." Then he drew a house. It had no roof, but a square of white space hovered above it, untouched. And in it, he wrote one word: someday. The next morning, a student came to him in secret. Then another, then two more. "Could you look at my sketch? Do you think this opening is too small for the sun? What if the room faced east instead?" Thomas didn't answer like a professor. He answered like someone building from memory. "My mom cries in the morning sometimes. If the light's too fast, it makes her cover her face. Try a softer angle here. This part's too quiet. If someone dies in the house, the quiet will get too loud. Put a breeze here." He spoke in ways no syllabus allowed, but somehow they made sense. More sense than most lectures ever did. By the end of the week, more than a dozen students had copies of his drawings pinned beside their projects. Not signed, just traced. Traced from memory, from grief, from light. And still, he had no name on the roll, no desk, no ID, no scholarship, no place. But somehow, every hallway whispered about the student who had no name, and yet taught them all how to see. He didn't cry. He just folded the page carefully, then turned it over and drew a door on the back. Not to the house in the picture, but to the place he had once imagined his name might be written. He shaded the doorway gently, then drew a hand reaching for it. Not opening, just reaching. That afternoon, Thomas didn't come to the studio, nor the next. He returned to the coffee cart beside his mother, silent, as if the cold in his chest had nothing to do with the wind. Raleigh found him on the third day. The professor ordered a black coffee for the first time ever, then sat beside the boy, elbows on knees, breath fogging in the morning air. He didn't speak right away. Just watched the traffic pass on Oxford Street, slow and half asleep. Then finally, "I should have said your name." Thomas didn't answer. Raleigh nodded, more to himself than anyone. They wouldn't have listened, perhaps, or they might have questioned how a child with no academic standing could teach us how to draw again. But I should have said your name anyway. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded page, cleaner than the one Thomas had found. Same photograph. But this copy had something added. A name, in Raleigh's own handwriting, penciled in beneath the caption, "Design by Thomas M. No degree, just light." Thomas looked at it, traced the letters with his good hand, then said softly, "I didn't mind they didn't write it. I minded they didn't ask." Raleigh lowered his gaze, because there are wounds that don't bleed, but they don't close either. That night, Thomas took the magazine and placed it under his mattress. Not to forget it, not to keep it, but just to know that something he built had been seen, even if no one knew who he was. And still he dreamed. He dreamed of a place with no locks, no rosters, no titles, just air, and light, and names whispered gently, like a wind through an old wooden frame. The next morning he returned to the studio. He didn't speak to anyone, but someone had left a note at his usual seat, scribbled on studio paper. Where should the light enter in a room where someone has stopped hoping? No name, just a question. Thomas smiled faintly, then began to sketch. Because if the world still wouldn't say his name, then the light would. There are conversations that don't begin with words. They begin with the weight of silence, the smell of something familiar, the echo of footsteps long remembered. This one began with a cup of black coffee. It was colder than usual that morning. Wind curled along the edge of Harvard Yard, chasing dry leaves into spirals. Thomas stood beside his mother's coffee cart. Same spot, same hour. His hands were tucked into his sleeves. He hadn't drawn anything in 2 days. He wasn't angry. He was just quiet in a way that felt older than his age. Then he saw him, Professor Raleigh, walking alone. No cane today, no briefcase, just his long wool coat and a pair of gloves held loosely in one hand. He stepped up to the cart and looked straight at Irene. "1 black coffee, please, no sugar." She blinked. "You sure, sir? That's the bitterest one I got." He smiled faintly. "It suits the morning." He took the cup, stepped aside, and motioned to Thomas. "Mind if I sit with you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. They sat on the curb side by side, a boy in a threadbare hoodie and a professor with tenure and a building named after his uncle. No one said a word for a while. Steam rose between them like a memory trying to lift. Finally, Raleigh spoke. "I used to live in a truck." Thomas looked over. The professor's eyes didn't waver. "My father worked freight. We couldn't afford rent, so we converted an old delivery truck into something sort of like a room. He built a shelf for my books and a window that didn't close right." He took a sip of the bitter coffee. "That window faced east. Every morning the sun came in, lit up the aluminum walls. I used to pretend it was a cathedral." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think that's why I became an architect. Not for design, for the way morning light forgives everything it touches." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then softly, "You still remember where the light came in?" Raleigh nodded. "Some things stay, even when everything else goes." They sat like that for a while, two people from different worlds bound by one common truth, that sometimes the only home we ever really have is the place light remembers us. Then Raleigh reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small object, a wooden architect's scale, worn smooth at the corners, initials faded with time. He turned it in his fingers, then handed it to Thomas. "This was mine, from when I was 19. I used it to draw my first real floor plan. The building was never built, but the scale stayed with me." Thomas took it gently. His thumb ran along its edge where years had pressed shape into the wood. "It's heavy," he said. Raleigh smiled. "So is memory." There was quiet. Then Thomas whispered, "Do you think someone like me could be an architect?" Raleigh didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy, at the way his fingers held the scale like it might disappear, at the small burn mark still healing on his wrist, at the way his eyes followed the sunlight as it shifted along the pavement. Then he said, "You already are." Thomas looked down. "But I don't have a name on any list. I don't have drawings in a portfolio." Raleigh leaned in. "You have something else. Something most of us spend years trying to remember." He pointed toward the rising sun. "You know what space feels like when it's touched by light. That's not something a diploma gives you. That's something life does." Thomas said nothing, but something in him settled, like a foundation finally poured after years of waiting for dry ground. The coffee turned cold. The wind picked up. Still they sat, and for the first time, Raleigh wasn't speaking as a professor. He was speaking as a man who had once drawn buildings just to feel less alone. And for the first time, Thomas wasn't listening as a boy who didn't belong. He was listening as someone who understood that silence is a material too. Before he left, Raleigh said one last thing. You know, Thomas, it took me 50 years to design a space that made people feel safe. You did it at 12. That's not talent. That's truth. Then he placed his gloved hand on the boy's shoulder, once, brief, firm, and walked away. That evening, Thomas sat in the corner of the basement room he shared with his mother. The wooden scale rested beside his pillow. He didn't draw anything that night. He didn't need to. Some days aren't for building. Some days are just for remembering why we build at all. The question came wrapped in formal language. Letters, forms, policies. But at its heart, it was a single word. Should he be allowed? The architecture faculty gathered in the old seminar room, oak walls, high ceilings, the faint scent of chalk and winter dust. 12 chairs, 12 voices, 12 minds shaped by degrees, publications, and tenure. On the table was a printed proposal. To grant Thomas M., an unofficial observer, the designation of special auditing student in the Harvard Graduate School of Design. No degree, no credits, just permission. To sit, to study, to belong. It had never been done, and not everyone agreed it should be. Professor Ellings was the first to speak. Her voice was firm. She always wore gloves indoors, fine black leather, as if the world outside her hands was too rough. We are not a charity. We are not a shelter. We are Harvard. She looked around the room. This boy has no academic record, no legal guardian on file, no documentation, no means of tuition. If we make an exception now, we undo decades of standard. Professor Marin, younger, replied quietly, "But we're not talking about lowering standards. We're talking about recognizing genius." Ellings didn't flinch. Genius is not the point. Governance is. Raleigh sat near the end of the table, arms folded. He hadn't spoken yet, but his fingers tapped once against the wood. Once, then again. A third professor spoke up. Chan, a designer of social housing in Taiwan. What does a school lose by allowing someone to learn quietly in its walls? Ellings answered without turning. Precedent, control, structure. Chan said softly, "And what does it gain?" Silence. Until finally, Raleigh leaned forward. "Let me tell you what he's done." He looked at them, not with anger, but with weight. The weight of someone who had buried too many forgotten students under the word policy. This boy has drawn what none of you have taught in 20 years. He has made students rethink space, question rhythm, feel something in their buildings again. Not because of technique, but because he remembers how light fell on his father's shoes the day he died. A pause. Can you teach that? No one answered. Then, someone cleared their throat near the door. It was Jesse. Behind him, hesitant, holding a folded sketchbook, stood Thomas. He had not been invited, but Raleigh gave a single nod, and the boy walked in. He stood at the head of the table, small, thin, hair messy, hoodie too large. He did not hold a portfolio. He did not show diagrams. He simply said, I heard you were deciding if I could stay. Ellings folded her arms. You may speak. He nodded, then looked at each person in the room, slowly. If I stay, my mother will sell coffee alone. I won't be there to help her push the cart at 4 a.m. He looked down. If I leave, she won't complain. She'll say, "Don't worry, baby, I'll manage." But I'll know her hands will ache and she'll miss the sunrise. A pause. Then he unfolded a small page. A sketch. A tiny cafe cart, drawn beside a wall of Harvard's campus. There were no people in it, just shadows. One tall, one small. The sun had just begun to touch the edge of the cart. I don't need a seat in the class, he said. I don't need a diploma. I just want to listen, like I always have. If that's not allowed, I'll still draw, but not here. He bowed slightly, not in submission, but in honesty, and silence followed. Long. Then Raleigh stood, spoke only one sentence. If this place can't make room for light like him, then we are only building prisons with better windows. When Thomas left the room, the debate was not over. But the silence had changed. Because truth, when said without bitterness, becomes unbearable to ignore. That night, Raleigh sat alone in his office. The vote was still pending, but on his desk was Thomas's sketch, the cafe cart, the shadow, the edge of morning, and for the first time in his 34 years as professor, he did not mark it. He did not grade it. He did not label it. He simply pinned it on his wall and turned the lamp off to let the real light come in. It came in a white envelope, thicker than most, sealed with the university crest, delivered not to a mailbox, for Thomas had none, but hand-carried by Professor Raleigh himself on a morning when the air smelled like first frost. He found the boy under the usual awning, folding napkins beside his mother's cart. "It's official," Raleigh said softly, holding out the envelope. "The board voted. You're in." Thomas took the envelope, looked at it, ran a finger along the gold-pressed seal, then didn't open it. Not yet. That night he sat on the floor of their basement room, the envelope still untouched. He turned it over. On the back he wrote nothing. Not his name. Not "thank you." He just stared at it as if it were a map to somewhere he didn't want to go alone. His mother noticed. "Thomas," she said gently, "is that something good?" He nodded, then asked, "If I left every morning without you, would you be okay?" She smiled, the kind of smile mothers wear like old coats, full of patches and stories and pain too familiar to name. "I've been okay since the day you were born, baby. But I'd be colder." She touched his cheek. "That's all." The next morning, Thomas brought the envelope to Raleigh's office. He placed it on the professor's desk, still sealed. "I can't," he said. "Not now." Raleigh stared at him. "You understand what this means?" Thomas nodded. "It means someone finally said my name, and I'm grateful." He looked away. "But if I sit in your class while my mother pushes the cart alone, it won't feel like light. It'll feel like shadow." Raleigh didn't argue, didn't push. He simply walked to the window and looked out across the yard, where leaves were falling like time forgetting its schedule. "I waited my whole life to hear someone speak like that," he said quietly. "Don't stay for my sake, Thomas. But if you do, make it mean something." He did stay, but not in Cambridge. 3 weeks later, a bus pulled out of South Station. On board, Thomas, his mother, and 4 students from Harvard's design school, Jesse among them, a backpack full of sketches, a look in his eyes that said, "I've learned what I came here for. Now, I want to build it somewhere real." They headed southwest, toward a town barely marked on the map. No art school, no design firm, just open land, dry light, and space waiting to be filled with meaning. At the bus stop, Raleigh came to say goodbye. He carried a box. Inside, a compass, a triangle, a notebook from 1972 filled with his own drawings, and a letter. But Thomas refused to open the box then. He said, "Later, when it's time." Then he reached into his satchel and handed Raleigh something in return. A model, made of recycled wood, nails bent straight, one beam missing, intentionally. Raleigh lifted the roof and saw the sunlight catch the floor in a very specific way. Then he noticed the inscription on the base. "For elders who forget their way home, but remember how light feels." Raleigh's voice caught. "Is this a design for a clinic?" Thomas shook his head. "It's a house, for people who are tired, so they can rest in peace before they have to die." He added softly, "You once told me you lived in a truck. I made this so next time, you don't have to." They didn't hug, but Raleigh placed both hands on the boy's shoulders firmly, and in a voice unshaken he said, "Thomas, you are not my student anymore. You are my colleague." The bus pulled away, and the yard returned to its stillness. But from that day on, every new student who passed Raleigh's office saw one model in a glass case. Simple, humble, no wall inscriptions, just light, and a brass plaque. Designed by a boy who turned down Harvard, so someone else wouldn't be left behind. 15 years passed, not quickly, not loud, just like wind through dry cotton fields, steady, invisible, honest. No one knew exactly when the school was built, because no one built it all at once. It began with a frame, then another, then a roof, patched together from tin, scrap wood, and the rusted spine of a highway billboard. The walls came last, if they could be called walls. Half were slatted, some were woven with strips of cloth, and one side was left completely open, facing the sunrise. The locals called it the wooden house, but the children called it the place where light learns your name. It stood just outside a forgotten town in northern New Mexico. No official address, no government support, no tuition, only children, from farms, from trailers, from silence. Some barefoot, some too shy to speak. But all of them carried one thing in common. They had questions the world never made room for. Inside the house there were no desks, just wide tables made from old doors, nails bent, then rebent. Chairs didn't match. The floor creaked. But in the morning, when the light fell just right across the beams, it looked like a cathedral remembering how to be a tree. Thomas never called himself teacher. He just called himself here. He showed the children how to build their first model from string and paper cups, not to impress, not to compete, but to ask, where would the wind pass through if this was your only home? He taught no equations, but one child, 8 years old, whispered, "I think this corner wants the sun more than the others." Thomas knelt, smiled. That's the first rule of building. Listen to what the space wants. The school had no sign, only a piece of driftwood nailed above the open door. Burned into it, in letters uneven. Light is the first teacher. Word spread. Slowly. An architect from Arizona came to visit, stayed for 3 days, left weeping. A mother walked 10 miles so her daughter could sit in the corner and draw without fear of grades. A retired welder donated a bin of wood scraps, and Thomas used every single one. Not for shelves, but for beams, slanted toward a single window so when the light came through it looked like music. And one day, long after anyone expected, someone else arrived. Older now, white hair, cane in hand. But his voice, still warm. It was Raleigh, now retired. Slower, but still a man whose silence filled a room more than most speeches. He walked in without knocking, sat at a table, watched the children drawing in charcoal on old roofing paper. No one introduced him. No one needed to. Thomas noticed him. From across the room their eyes met. Neither stood, neither smiled. They just sat there, one at the end of a road, the other at the beginning, and let the moment speak. Later, after the children had left for the day, Raleigh stayed behind. They sat on the porch, feet in the dust. The sun was low now, its light slanting across the wooden beams, brushing the floor in gold. Raleigh turned to Thomas. "You've built what none of us could." Thomas shook his head. "I built what I needed when I was 12. A pause. Then Raleigh whispered, "And what do you need now?" Thomas looked out into the long field where dusk was slowly unfolding. "To stay here, that's all." They didn't talk after that. They just watched. The wind moved through the slats. A child's paper model still dangled from a string beam, spinning slowly in the light. And as the final ray of sun touched the table, Raleigh reached out, let his hand rest on the wood, felt the warmth, soft and quiet, then said, almost to the light itself, "Thank you, Thomas. Because of you, I learned how to see again. See, there are children whose names are never called, no seats saved for them, no welcome letters sent. They come, quietly, and then they go. But when the light passes through where they once sat, we realize we've just learned something no one ever taught us before." Thomas was one of those children. He wasn't a flawless prodigy. He didn't win international awards. He didn't argue with anyone. He simply let the light pass through him. And because of that, others began to see again, with eyes not yet shut by age, success, or sorrow. I didn't write this story to celebrate genius. I wrote it to thank those who lived quietly, unnoticed, but who, by simply staying kind and steady, kept the rest of us from falling apart. A father who stood still in the morning light. A mother who never complained as she pushed the coffee cart. A child who drew with plastic lids and clothesline wire because he had no money for paper. They never asked to be called gifted. They just wanted the light tomorrow to fall exactly where it was needed. And if you, the one still reading these last lines, have ever stepped back to give someone else your place, have ever sat in a room where no one called your name, have ever drawn from memory, not software, then this story was written for you, not so that you may be seen, but so you might remember. You were never gone. The light is simply still finding its way to you. To every reader who sat beside this story in stillness, thank you. Whether you were a teacher, a parent, an architect of homes or hearts, this story carries a little of you. May the light find you gently and stay longer this time. The author.